Today I'm going to model the historical thinking process of using text, context, and subtext to analyze primary sources to get at social studies content. I'm going to be using the 5th grade social studies unit on the American Revolution, and I'm going to analyze the primary source, Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. So once I've chosen my primary source, I want to identify what the students will get out of analyzing this primary source. So I'm going to go back to the CAP documents and find that the grade level expectation for this primary source is going to be analyzing historical sources from multiple points of view to develop an understanding of historical context. The big idea that we're going to keep in mind is perspective. And my overarching essential questions are: how does connecting people, events, and ideas help interpret history? And what can an artifact reveal or not reveal? So I've outlined this in a template that just has the grade level expectations, my essential questions, and the big idea. And again, this is the primary source that I'll be using to do that. So the first step in doing this is making sure that you know how to go through the process of text. And text, all that means is what you see, okay? And you're going to stick with what you notice on the primary source, whether it's a picture, an artifact, or a writing, and you just say what is visible, readable, how do you know that, and it's maybe easier to break it up into small chunks and think about what you're looking at. So as I look at this document, I can take it in pieces, and I can see that it says the Bloody Massacre up here, and I can see that there's a moon, although it looks like it's daytime outside. This looks like to be in a city. I can see a lot of colonists or individuals here that are being shot and fallen, and there's a dog in the foreground. There are lots of redcoats firing all at the same time at these colonists, and it looks like this gentleman is demanding them to fire or commanding them to fire. So that's just looking at the text and seeing what I see. Some of these colonists are also helping other colonists. What I don't see is sometimes is equally important. These people here have no guns, no firearms whatsoever, and these people do. They look like they're in formation to kill, and these people are unarmed, and they're kind of in a close proximity. So that's looking at the text of what is on Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. So I've outlined that here for you so you can see kind of some of the notes that kids might bring up when they're analyzing the text. And again, there's no judgments made here, there's no inference made here or conclusions drawn. You're just reporting what you see. Now the next step in this process is looking at context, and what that means is what's going on in the time period. Okay, so you're asking students what background information they have that explains the information found in the source. What do they know about this topic already? And what might be new information for me? In this particular situation of this engraving, reading the Boston incident will help students gain a little more context. You might not always have a specific piece that students could look at or read to build that context. It's actually a time for you to help them recall what they already know about what's going on. So in the Boston incident, they read that news takes a long time to travel throughout the colonies. British soldiers were actually being taunted and had snowballs, glass, and stick thrown at them. The soldiers were actually demanded not to fire. And this group of soldiers, this specific group, had been harassed for a long time. There were many more colonists than soldiers, and they were kind of creating a riot. And the British soldiers have been sent to Boston to keep the peace. And this isn't necessarily in the Boston incident, but just background knowledge that the students should have in this unit of study. And then that some colonists, who are called patriots, are not happy with the soldiers being there. Some colonists, who are called rebel rousers, have actually been taunting the soldiers. Some colonists are not happy with England. Boston was considered a hotspot for rebel activity. British soldiers were not happy about having to be in Boston to keep the peace. There are patriots trying to get people to join their cause, and some people are considering going war to gain independence from Great Britain. And then also knowing that there are patriots, loyalists, and fence-sitters, and what their roles are in all of this helps with the context. Now students might come up with a lot more information than this about what's going on in the time. You try to keep them in something that's relevant to the actual document that you're analyzing, but you also know that with your end in mind, that what we've set out from our essential questions, that we want to keep information that's kind of going to get us there. The next step after doing the context is the subtext, and that's where the real learning, I think, can take place. And this is where what conclusions can be drawn from the artifact. It's reading between the lines, so to speak, what's not there. So some questions you could ask are, who created the source, and what do we know about that person, and for whom was the source created? Why was this source produced when it was? Okay, so these are some questions you could ask these kids to help them think about why you're analyzing that particular source. So they might come up with that this engraving was done by Paul Revere, which was in the information, and we know that Paul Revere was a patriot, and we also know that patriots were trying to gain independence from the king and get people to join their side. We also know that the engraving was produced and sent to colonies all up and down the East Coast, and that patriots' beliefs were that they wanted to convince fence-sitters to join the patriot cause. And the engraving doesn't necessarily match the incident that we read on what actually happened. So it makes it look like the soldiers were firing on defenseless colonists. The engraving makes it look like the soldiers are being ordered to fire, which we also know wasn't true. And the piece was produced at a time when tension was high in Boston, and people were deciding what to do about the king and his acts. So that's just looking at between the lines in order to get the subtext. You could lead them down this path depending on how much they're gathering from what you expected them to, and hopefully lead to this idea of propaganda, and that's what Paul Revere's engraving was all about. But getting them to draw that conclusion is really important. And then for a closure and wrap up, you want to make sure that you go back to your essential questions, and you're asking students the questions that you wanted them to get from the beginning. And you want to know how these students are processing the information. So this is good assessment data for you on the spot. Are they acquiring the critical thinking skills that you targeted? And what lingering misconceptions remain that might require you to circle back and address? So again, deciding what to teach the next day based on what this lesson is telling you. Here are some ideas that you could use to kind of close this lesson. What do I know about this topic? Students could answer that question. Where's the evidence to support my thinking? So they're going to use the primary source to do that. And how has my thinking changed about the Boston Massacre? Or you could fill in the blank with patriot beliefs or fence-sitter beliefs or propaganda. Any of those words would kind of help them show or demonstrate what they know. And then always go back to the essential question that you originally set out to have them answer, and what can an artifact reveal or not reveal. And this could be a writing prompt or just a closing conversation. And it could be, how did Paul Revere's engraving reveal what the attitude was in Boston for patriots, fence-sitters, and loyalists? And what does it not reveal, and why? So this is getting at the essential question, but using the information that you got from your subtext analyzation. And then how does connecting people, events, and ideas help reveal history? So knowing who created that engraving obviously had an effect on the way it was interpreted. And how does knowing the actual events of the Boston Massacre reveal the engraving's role in history? So they're looking at this essential question as a way to demonstrate their understanding going through the historical thinking process of text, context, subtext.